Great. You know, there's a bunch of stuff that I did at school, I'm sure you have as well, that you've never used in everyday life. Is that true? Is it just me? You know, I have never used algebra or performed an algebraic equation outside of the classroom. I've never asked Monsieur or Madame Dupont from La Rochelle the way to the bank or the bibliothèque, and I think that's the library, is it? And I've never had chance to talk about or to use my understanding of your sweet and sour taste buds and where they are on your tongue. You know, it's never even come up in a pub quiz. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying learning is a bad thing. Actually, I think learning is a really good thing. I think actually we should constantly be learning. I think we should constantly be discovering new things and increasing our knowledge and our awareness. But at some point, we have to ask ourselves this question. So what? There you go. We have to ask that question. So what? You know, knowledge in itself isn't that useful. Applied knowledge is a game changer. Just knowledge for the sake of knowledge, well, I mean, that might be interesting and there's benefit and all of those sort of things, but actually where knowledge really comes into its own, where learning and discovery really comes into its own, is when we apply it. It's when we use it. It's when we live it out. Now, we're coming towards the end of this series called Growing on the Front Line, and for a bunch of weeks, we've been exploring what does it mean for us to grow on our front line. We recognize that we all have a front line. Now, your front line is where you spend the majority of your time. Could be at work, could be at home, it could be socially with other people. For most of us, our front line is not here. Our front line isn't in a church environment. Our lives are made up of various elements, you know, our emotional life, our professional life, our social life, our financial life, our spiritual life. And if your spiritual life is only confined or only exists within the walls of church, or you know, on a Sunday morning or a Wednesday if you're in a small group, if that's the only place where your spiritual life is exercised or energized, well, you're not going to grow as well as you could. And what we've been looking at is how do we grow to be more like Jesus whenever and wherever we are. And this is something that's relevant for all of us, wherever we are on this spectrum of faith. You know, you might be somebody who is just starting out on this adventure of faith. You might not class yourself as a Christian. You might not be sure if you believe the things that I believe, and you might not be sure who Jesus is or what you think about Jesus, but you're still on this journey. And there's still opportunities for you to grow in your understanding, your awareness of who Jesus is, what it means to be a person of faith wherever you are. And that's true as well if you're at this other end. If you've been following Jesus for many years, there's still things for you to discover. There's still things for you to learn. There's still opportunities for you to grow in your faith. And that's what we've been doing. We've been spending a bunch of weeks talking about how do we actually do this. And a bunch of us have been talking about this midweek in our small groups. We've been unpacking some of the stuff we've been talking about on a Sunday, and there's some other content and discussing it and talking about, well, how do I grow on my front line wherever we are? We've put a lot of time and a lot of energy and a lot of resources into this. And therefore today, as we start to wrap this up, we've got one more week next week, but as we begin to sort of bring this to land, I want to ask ourselves this question. So what? After all that time and energy and investment and talking about it and thinking about it and discussing it and praying about it, what is the so what? What's happened as a result? I've just noticed the technology's fallen over for me again, but never mind. So we'll carry on and see where we go this morning. So what? We spent ages talking about this and investing in it and just trying to figure out, well, what does it mean for me to grow on my front line? So what? You know, the things that we're talking about here is about how do I live out my life? How do I live out my faith wherever I am and with whomever I am? And if I want to grow in my front line, if I want to grow to be more like Jesus on my front line, it means I need to act more like Jesus in my front line? And actually, there's three ways that we look at that. We're going to think about how do we act, how do we interact, and how do we react. You know, if I'm a Jesus follower, my faith should impact the way I do these things. My faith should impact the things I think, the things I say, and the things I do. My faith should impact the way I relate to other people. It should impact the way I interact with you and how I speak to people and what people experience when they encounter me. And my faith should impact how I react. You know, when situations or circumstances happen, my faith should be impacted and my faith should impact and influence the way I react or the way I respond to those situations. And today I want us to think about one of these areas, which I think actually shows us what really is going on under the surface. I want us to highlight one of these three things and explore, well, what does it mean to actually allow faith to impact that and for us to grow on our front line with that? And it's this third one, our reactions, how we react. Because, you know, how we react shows what's really going on under the surface. You can sort of fake your actions, you can fake your interactions. I mean, you can fake your reactions, but it takes a lot more time and it takes a lot more discipline. Generally, the way that we react actually shows something, what is actually happening within us. And I'm sure you can all think of a situation where you've seen somebody react or perhaps overreact. And it's compelling, isn't it? Maybe you're in the supermarket and you're just doing your shopping and there's the parent who's telling the child off, and there's something compelling about it because you just want to, you listen and you're sort of immersed in this sort of conflict that's happening over there. I mean, you do it subtly. You don't pull up a chair and open a bag of popcorn and watch it, but you're sort of aware of what's going on, and this parent telling the child off and shouting at them, and the child crying and screaming. And to be fair, you can't ignore it because the whole store can hear what's going on. And this funny thing is, in that overreaction is that you see this parent this adult having to go at a child for acting like a child, and they do it in a way that maybe actually, well, is that like an adult, or you're setting a childish example there? Or it's the social media thing, somebody makes an unhelpful comment, and then somebody comments on that, and then it just sparks a tirade of abuse and public digital disagreement, and then other people weigh in and all those things. If you've not seen that, go on the Finchampstead and Barkham Facebook page. That tends what it'd be. I just open it, scroll, popcorn. Oh, they did not say that. Also, and you see, you just can't help yourself because there's something about an overreaction that's compelling. It draws you in. But we know that when we pause, we know that an overreaction is a sign that there's something more going on in the situation. We know that when somebody overreacts, it's not just because of that thing, it's because of a whole load of stuff that's going on. We know that when the parent overreacts in the supermarket, it's not because their child has just picked up that thing and put it in the trolley. It's because of all the other stuff that they've had to endure that day, just getting them out and getting their shoes on and getting them in the car and getting them out of the car and into a trolley and all of those sort of things. We know that an overreaction is because there's so much more going on. And that's why this is so important, because our reactions tell us what really is going on inside us. So I want us to spend a few moments just thinking about that, and we're going to look at something that Jesus said that I'm pretty sure you've all heard this before. Now, if you've been a Jesus follower for many years, if you've been coming to church for many years, you've definitely heard this. This isn't new to you. But if you've never even opened the pages of the Bible before, if you've never been to church before, if you're watching this online later on, the stuff that we're going to talk about, actually you've come across before. So let's take a look. Jesus is saying, Matthew's recorded this for us. Jesus says, you've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. You've heard that. Maybe here you've heard that, but actually out in the world, you've heard this. This is a common statement. And in large, you agree with this. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. That's sort of an ancient principle about how you do life. It's how the world works. And we almost expect it. What this means is that if you do something to me, I'm allowed to do the same thing back to you. Nobody is shocked when somebody retaliates against somebody who's done something to them. It's almost expected. If you hurt me, I'm allowed a free shot to hurt you back. It's just the way of the world. You've heard this, you've seen this, you've experienced this, you've encountered this, you've lived this. Nobody's surprised when this has happened. But Jesus says, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. Now, let's be really clear here. Jesus isn't talking about self-defense. He's not talking about retaliation. He's talking about retaliation, not protection. So he's not talking about when somebody comes and attacks you. He's not talking about what to do if somebody is abusing you and just allowing them to walk all over you. That's not what Jesus is talking about here. He's talking about how we retaliate or how we respond when somebody hurts us or offends us or annoys us or upsets us. And what Jesus is saying, look, you've heard that the way of the world is an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. You know, it's transactional. You do this and you get to pay them back. But I want you to do something different. I want to offer you a different way of being. I want you to offer you a different way of reacting. I don't want you to react in the same way that everybody else does. Let's read on. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. Now, again, you've heard this, turning the other cheek. Jesus said that. That's where it came from. Now, how do you slap someone on the right cheek? Dave, could I borrow you? Thank you. Come on. Give a round of applause for Dave. Thank you. Just jump up on the stairs. How do you slap somebody on the right cheek? We're gonna demonstrate this now. Now, you can just stand there. Yeah, we'll maybe argue in a minute. In the ancient world, everybody was right-handed. Now, I've got a twin brother. He's left-handed. And I remember actually when he was at school, when we were starting out in infant school, teachers told him to not use his left hand and sort of made him to use his right hand to correct his left-handedness. I mean, that's pretty horrific, but that's what my brother experienced because everyone is right-handed. So, that's the way. So if I want to just point to your right cheek, where's your right cheek? So if I want to slap you on the right cheek, I have to do it like this. No, I won't do it, but like backhand like that, which is not a sign of aggression. It's a sign of sort of, it's an insult, isn't it? There you go. You can sit down. I'll give you a hug. Thank you. Round of applause for Dave. Thank you. Do you know what? It took so much willpower, not just, no, I wouldn't do that. But you see that Jesus saying, if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. He's not talking about aggression. He's not talking about violence. He's talking about insulting there. That's a sign of that's being dismissive to somebody in there. So if somebody does that, don't respond in the same way that everybody else does. Now, people, when Jesus said this, they would have understood exactly what Jesus is talking about because there's a cultural thing in there that we just don't tend to understand necessarily in our culture or our context. And it warrants a response. It warrants a reaction, an eye for an eye. If somebody does that to you, it's insulting. They've insulted you. You're supposed to respond in a way. But Jesus says, don't react, don't respond in the same way that everybody else does. And he follows this on with a comment about their legal system, which is completely different to our legal system. We don't fully understand the context of what Jesus is saying there. And their legal system, well, it's totally changed to our legal system, largely because of the things that Jesus said about mercy and justice in those things. But then Jesus carries on this train of thought, and he uses something else that, again, you've heard, you use in everyday language, but we don't quite fully understand what it meant in its original context. He says, if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. You've heard this, haven't you? You've heard this phrase, go the extra mile and those sort of things. What Jesus is saying here, he's referring to this thing called the compulsory public order that was in place. That, Israel at the time was under Roman occupation, and there's a bunch of Roman soldiers around, largely to keep the peace, largely to stop a rebel uprising or an insurgent on those things. And there was a thing in place, this compulsory public order, that a Roman soldier could come up to you if you were an able-bodied man and you didn't have anything else better to do, or as in you weren't busy, and they could command you to carry their stuff for a total of 1,000 paces, or 1000 passes, as it is in the Latin. Hey, there you go. I used some of the Latin that I did at school. What am I kidding? I didn't do Latin at school. I barely did English at school. Google for you there. But anyway, he could come back, say, you need to carry this mille paces, 100,000 paces, where we get our mile from. And, people hated this in the culture of the time. The Israelites hated the Roman soldiers, the occupying oppressive force. And this was a thing they couldn't do anything about. So when they saw, a Roman soldier coming their way, everybody would put their heads down, they would look busy because they just didn't want to be caught up on this because there's nothing that they could do about it. And it was something that was often abused by the Roman soldiers as well, that they would make people do things, they had other stuff, important stuff to do. So people would try anything to sort of ignore. It's like when you're in a small group and somebody says, does anybody want to read the passage today? And everybody looks down, looks at my look, my shoes are so interesting. Or because you don't want to make eye contact. Or when we're talking about, does anybody want to help volunteer in a program? Everyone looks down. No, don't make eye contact with them because then I'll have to do it. It's exactly the same thing, but on a whole another level. And so people would ignore it. They wouldn't want to do it. And we can't quite understand the level of animosity that there is between the Israelites and the Roman soldiers at the time. They hated them. They despised them. So, Jesus is saying, if a soldier comes up to you and forces you to go 1 mile, I know what you will do. You all look down, you all ignore it, and then if you can't get out of it, you do the bare minimum. You will moan and you will complain. You will walk as slowly as possible. You'll drag their coat through the mud if you can. You will do the least amount of work possible because you despise this person. But I want you to say to them at the end of the mile, I'll take it another mile. I will go an extra mile. Now that phrase, going the extra mile, has different meaning in our context. We use it to refer to doing a good job, going above and beyond. That's not what Jesus is saying here. He's not talking about what do you do when your friend asks you for a favor. Yeah, I'm going to go the extra mile. He's saying, what do you do when somebody you despise, when somebody you can't tolerate, when somebody you struggle with? What do you do when your enemy comes and asks you for help? Then I want you to go above and beyond. Then I want you to go the extra mile. And people listen to this will start to struggle with that. Is that really, Jesus? Are you sure? Am I hearing you? You right? Is this really what you want us to say? But he's not finished. He continues. He says, you've heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. And like, yes. We've heard that. That's the way of the world. Of course, we love the people who are close to us, and we hate the people who hate us. We go out of our way to make life difficult for the people who make our lives difficult. It's just the transactional eye for an eye way of the world. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Just imagine the people standing around listening to Jesus saying this. So they're like, can you go back to the stuff on prayer? That was a bit more easy. We can get on board with that. That was nicer and those sort of things. Where's the fish and the bread? We like that one. This one is much more difficult. Love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. The people would have struggled with this. And the reason they struggled with it is the same reason we struggle with it. This is not how the world works. Nobody expects you to do this. You're not supposed to love your enemies. You're not supposed to pray good. You're not supposed to think good things or pray for people who do difficult things to you. You've got a free pass. You're allowed to hate your enemies. You're allowed to make life difficult for people who make your life difficult. It's the way of the world. It's how everybody does it. It's expected. But Jesus says, I want you to be different, and I want you to live differently. And why would we do that? Well, because of this. That you may become children of your Father in heaven. See, Jesus says, when you live like this, you reflect what your Father in heaven is like. When we live like this, when we react or respond in a way that isn't in keeping with the way that everybody reacts or responds, we reflect our Father in heaven. How do we know what God is like? Well, we know what God is like by looking at what Jesus is like. When we see Jesus and we hear Jesus and we see the things that Jesus said and the things that Jesus did, we have an understanding of who God is. And actually, Jesus said that. Thomas said to him, Lord, show us the Father and that'll be enough for us. And Jesus says, haven't you got it? You've seen me. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. So if we want to know what God is like, we just need to flick through the pages of the New Testament and see what Jesus is like. What did Jesus say? What did Jesus do? That gives us an understanding of who God is. But what do people do if they're not going to flick through the pages of the New Testament? How do they know what God is like? For people who we come into contact with, the people who we might put on that list as our enemies, the people who persecute us or irritate us or upset us or offend us, the people who might not be in a situation where actually they have access to a Bible or have the intention to open it and flick through the pages of the Gospels to see what Jesus is like. How do they discover what God is like? Well, they do that in a way through seeing how we live. There's a transactional way of living, because everybody, we do it in the same way. When something happens, we react. That's just how it is. Something happens and we react. And the way that our world functions isn't a million miles away from the ancient principle of an eye for an eye. Somebody does something to you and you're supposed to do the same thing back. And actually, what's almost expected is for us to overreact in those situations. That when somebody does something to us, we're sort of allowed almost to let them know, well, you've upset me, you've offended me, you've hurt me, and I'm going to pay back to you what you've paid back to me. Nobody's surprised when we overreact, when we pay back more than what somebody has given to us. It's just the way that the world is. But Jesus, I think, is saying, look, this is how everybody does it, but not with you. I want you to live a different way. If you're a follower of me, if you believe in me, if you want to live your life as I would if I was in your shoes, if you want to grow to be more like me wherever you are, I don't want you to react by overreacting. I want you to react by underreacting. I want you to take a different way. And if the norm is to overreact and we do the same, well, what's different about us? If everybody reacts in this way and we do the same, what's different about us? What do people experience when they experience us? And if these things sort of grabs people's attention, there's something about the overreaction that you just can't help watching it. An underreaction stops people in their tracks. It's that example of the person at work who hasn't done what they said they would do. They said, I'll do this is my deadline, and they mess up on it for whatever reason, and that coworker is left to pick up the slack. But they respond with grace and understanding. They don't fly off the handle because of that thing that's happened. It's the person who is owed money and the person comes back to them and they're not able to pay them back. They don't overreact in their reaction. They react with understanding. They react with grace and they react with patience. It's the person who you've let your lawnmower out to and they bring it back and they've broken it. And this is the way that you're expected to overreact. They're scared to come and say, oh, I've done this, I'm really sorry, because they're expecting this. And you respond with this. That's what Jesus is saying. This is different. The world does this, but I want you to respond in this way. Because when you respond in this way, you give people a glimpse of who I am. You give people a glimpse of what God is like, that they're able to see God through the way that you react. It's choosing to respond with grace and patience. It's choosing to respond with understanding and compassion, where everybody else responds with the usual annoyance, with anger and aggression. Jesus is saying, look, this is the way of the world. I don't want you to do that. I want you to choose a different path. I want you to choose a different option. I want you to choose grace and patience. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't have justice. It doesn't mean that we don't have standards. It doesn't mean that we don't actually tell people that they're wrong when they're wrong and have discipline and all those things. But we do that in a way that is led with grace and patience, not with aggression, anger, and annoyance. We do that in a way that actually thinks the best and believes the best in people, that there's understanding and compassion. Sure, we can have truth and grace in those situations, but we need both of those together. And actually, the standard way is just this. No, you've not done what you said you've done. You've hurt, you've offended, you've messed up, you've not made the grade, whatever it is, and we're able to respond in that way. Jesus says, no, there's a better way, there's a different way to doing this. And when we respond like this, we respond in a way that God is like, because this is what God is like. He responds to us in these ways. He doesn't respond with anger, with annoyance, or with aggression. Now, let me jump to a thing that Paul said. Paul was one of the leaders of the early church. He wrote lots of the letters that we find in the New Testament. And to the followers of Jesus in Rome, Paul says this: "For if while we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to him through the death of his son, how much more, having been reconciled, shall we be saved through his life?" You know, Paul is talking about this amazing thing that Jesus has done. And he's saying, look, whilst we were enemies with God, whilst we turned our back on God, whilst we ignored God, whilst we disobeyed God, whilst we ignored God in his own creation and we went on living our own ways, we were enemies with him. How did God respond to that? How did God react to our turning our back on him, to our ignoring him in his own creation? Well, he responded by reconciling us to him. That means restoring that broken relationship. And how did he do that? Well, through the death of his son. And if he did that whilst we were enemies, you know, now that we've been reconciled, those of us who are followers of Jesus, how much more shall we be saved through his life, through those things that he continues to do for us? You see, God responded to us in a way that we wouldn't respond to him if we were in his situation and his shoes. You know, God didn't use his position and his power to say, well, I'll show them. You know, they think they can do life without me. They think they can do this on their own. They think they can ignore me. I will show them. God didn't use his position and his power to do that like we would have done probably. That's how we would have reacted. He reacted with grace and patience, with mercy, with compassion. See, Jesus reacted to our sin by dying for it, to pay for it. Jesus reacted to the wrongdoing that we did against him and against our Heavenly Father, not by wiping us out, not by shunning us, not by paying back to us what we've done, not by overreacting. He reacted to our sin by dying for it in order to pay for it, so that we may be reconciled to him, so that we may still have this relationship with him. He did that. You know, where we would have reacted or overreacted, God went the extra mile. We were enemies of him. We had offended him. We'd hurt him. We'd ignored him. And he went the extra mile to reach across time and space, to take hold of us and to draw us back into a living, dynamic relationship with him. And this has happened 2,000 years ago. This has happened. So the question that we need to ask ourselves is, so what? So what? Jesus has done that. So what? Well, the so what is, if you want to continue to grow on your front line, it requires you to be careful with how you act or how you interact, and especially how you react. If you wanted to grow to be more like Jesus wherever you are, it requires you to act more like Jesus or react more like Jesus wherever you are. See, our reactions are a response and a reflection. It's a response, you know, of what's going on in the world outside us, and it's a reflection of what is going on inside us. You know, if we respond in the same way that everybody else does, then what's inside us is the same as what everybody else is. But what we've discovered through this series is that's not true. No, actually, what is inside me is different. Because what is inside me isn't just myself or my own selfishness or my own impatience, my own anger or annoyance. What's inside me as a follower of Jesus is the Spirit of God, the same Spirit that was at work within Jesus, that enabled him to do all the things that he did, that enabled him to live the life that he lived, that enabled him to react and respond in the way that he reacted and responded. That same Spirit is at work in me, not because there's anything special about me, but because I choose to believe in him and put my hope and my trust in him. And if that's you, if you're at this stage in the journey where you've put your hope and your trust in Jesus, that same Spirit is at work within you and flows through you. Our reaction should be a reflection of what is going on within us. You know, the way that we understand what God is like is by looking at who Jesus is and what Jesus is like. And you know, we can flick through the pages of the New Testament to do that. The way our friends and our family and our colleagues, our neighbors, our enemies will discover what God is like is not probably by flicking through the pages of the New Testament. It's by looking at what you're like, by looking at the way you act and the way you interact and the way that you react. That your actions, your interactions, and especially your reactions will show people what God is really like. Just allow that to sink in for a moment. Your actions, if you're a follower of Jesus, the way you act, the way you interact, and the way you react will show people what God is really like. Because God's at work in you. God is alive within you. His Spirit is in you. So are your actions, your interactions, your reactions a response, a reflection of what God is like? Or is that drawing just from the same old stuff that is in everybody else, that's in the same world, that same annoyance, that same anger, that same aggression, that same apathy? Or do your reactions draw on something far deeper, far greater? That as you go from here, the so what, and as we go home and we go to work and we go amongst our front line, when people encounter us, what do they encounter? When people experience us, what do they experience? The same as everywhere else, or something different, something inspiring, something transforming? Not because we are special, but because of the one who is in us is special, because of the love and the grace and the mercy and the compassion and the peace and the justice that is at work within us, because the Spirit of God, who's the Spirit of all those things, is at work within us. You know, what do people encounter when they encounter you? It takes discipline in those moments when a reaction is required or a reaction is going to happen because we've experienced something and we respond to it. It takes discipline to hit pause and to not respond in the same way that maybe naturally or left to ourselves we want to. It takes discipline to hit pause and to think, God, what would you do if you were in my situations? Jesus, how would you respond to this person in front of me? How do I love this person in front of me who I'm struggling with right now? Because they've done this, and everything within me wants to respond or react like that. But I want to be different because you are different, and you are at work within me. We're going to get the band back up on stage. You know, we can talk about this, and we can discuss this, and if you're in a small group this week, you'll talk about this, and there's a great pause reflection, a thing to do, a tool that can help you in those moments to pause, to pray, just to take the heat out of the situation, and all those things are excellent. But at some point, we have to say, so what? You know, we can talk about it, we can learn about it, that's really important, we can discuss it, we can debate it, but at some point, we have to start living it. And that's the challenge that we have, that as we go into our front lines, we're people who take the Spirit of God with us. That people, when they see us, they see God in some way. When people encounter us, they encounter the goodness, the compassion, the mercy, the joy, the patience, the understanding that God has for us and God has for them. Let's pray together. Father God, I thank you so much that you love us like this. I thank you so much that you didn't respond to us in the way that we would respond or the way that the world would respond. I thank you that you responded with mercy and with grace and with compassion. That you went the extra mile for us, even whilst we were estranged to you, even while we ignored you and rebelled against you. You gave everything for us. And I pray, Lord, that you would help us grow to be more like Jesus. That in the way that we live and the way that we react, we would reflect the goodness, the greatness, the glory, the majesty of who you are. That as people encounter us, they may see a glimpse of the love that you have for them. Bless us, Lord, I pray. Amen.